There is a passage in Nietzsche's The Gay Science that should unsettle every one of us, not because it is violent or shocking, but because it cuts to the very root of how we give meaning to our lives. A madman runs into the marketplace in the middle of the day, holding a lantern, screaming, "I see God, I seek God." The people around him laugh, and then the madman turns and says something that should stop us cold. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, the common mistake, the one that has persisted for over a century, is to read this as a simple statement of atheism. A philosopher triumphantly declaring that religion is over, that science has won, and that we are free. But that is precisely the opposite of what Nietzsche meant. If you read the full passage, the madman doesn't celebrate. He mourns. He is terrified. He looks at the crowd and says, "We have killed him. You and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun?" This is not a victory speech. This is a diagnosis of a civilizational wound, one that Nietzsche believed most people hadn't yet noticed. And in this video, we are going to explore what he really meant, why it matters more today than ever, and what the death of God does to the human psyche. To understand the depth of Nietzsche's proclamation, we first need to understand what God represented, not just theologically, but psychologically and culturally. For thousands of years in the Western world, God was not simply a being you believed in on Sunday morning. God was the ground of reality. God was the source of objective moral truth. God was the answer to the question, why does any of this matter? The cosmic order, the hierarchies of values, the meaning of suffering, the promise that justice would ultimately prevail, all of this rested on a single foundation, that there was a transcendent order, a divine lawgiver, a reality beyond the visible world that gave the visible world its ultimate significance. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he is not primarily making a metaphysical claim. He is making a cultural and psychological observation. The belief in God, the living, operative faith that structured Western civilization for centuries, is collapsing. And crucially, it is collapsing from within. The Enlightenment, the rise of science, the historical criticism of scripture, and the Industrial Revolution. All of these are expressions of values that Christianity itself had nurtured. The love of truth, the importance of honesty, and the relentless drive to understand the world as it really is. In other words, it was the Christian devotion to truth that ultimately undermined the believability of Christianity itself. Nietzsche wrote, "What really triumphed over the Christian God was Christian morality itself. This is one of the most penetrating insights in all of Western philosophy. The very intellectual conscience that Christianity cultivated turned against its own foundations. And this left Western humanity in an unprecedented situation. A civilization with all of its habits, institutions, and moral instincts still shaped by a worldview, but with the foundation of that worldview quietly crumbling beneath them." Now, here is where the psychology becomes deeply important and deeply unsettling. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a psychological necessity. Viktor Frankl, writing from the hell of the Nazi concentration camps, observed that those who survived were not necessarily the physically strongest. They were the ones who had a why, a reason to endure. Meaninglessness, Frankl argued, is not just an intellectual problem. It is a wound in the soul. It manifests as depression, as anxiety, as a pervasive sense that nothing truly matters. Nietzsche saw this coming. He predicted that the death of God would not immediately be recognized for what it was. Instead, it would manifest slowly, as a creeping nihilism, as the sense that there are no objective values, that morality is merely a social construction, that science can tell us how the world works but cannot tell us why we should care about anything in particular, that all our striving ultimately adds up to nothing. He wrote, "Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests?" And his answer was clear. It comes from the collapse of the foundation. When the highest values devalue themselves, When we can no longer believe in the ground that once gave everything its worth, we are left with what Nietzsche called the abyss. This psychological abyss is not merely abstract. Think of modern epidemic of purposelessness, the extraordinary rates of depression, anxiety, addiction, and loneliness in the most materially prosperous societies in human history. There is something deeply paradoxical about a world that has never had more wealth, comfort, and information, and yet has never seemed so spiritually hollow for so many. Nietzsche would not be surprised. He would say, "You removed the sun, and now you are surprised that it is dark." But here is what makes Nietzsche's diagnosis even more layered. He did not think people would simply accept the void. He thought they would fill it, and fill it badly. In one of the most prophetic passages in all of modern philosophy, he wrote, "God is dead, but given the way of man, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too." What are the shadows of God? They are the secular substitutes, the ideologies and systems that took on the psychological function of religion without acknowledging that is what they were doing. Look at the great political religions of the 20th century. Marxism, fascism, extreme nationalism, each offered what religion had always offered: a cosmic narrative of history, a vision of paradise, a community of the faithful, moral clarity about who the enemy was, and the promise that sacrifice today would lead to redemption tomorrow. These were not secular movements. Psychologically, they were profound religious and profoundly catastrophic. The psychologist Carl Jung, deeply influenced by Nietzsche, observed that when a person suppresses or loses their connection to the transcendent, the unconscious does not simply go quiet. The psychic energy that was once channeled into religious devotion has to go somewhere. And when it is not integrated consciously, it erupts in projection, in fanatism, and in the demonization of others. We can see the shadow of God everywhere today. It appears in the quasi-religion's fervor of political tribalism, where people find their identity, their community, their moral certainty, and their scapegoats in political movements. It appears in the cult of consumerism, the promise that if you acquire the right things, you will finally be complete. It appears in the worship of celebrities and influencers, who serve the ancient function of gods and heroes, embodying the idealized self that we project onto them. It appears in the desperate search for belonging in online communities that, at their best, offer genuine connection and, at their worst, become ideological echo chambers with all the psychological dynamics of fundamentalism. None of this was planned. It emerged organically, because the psychological need that religion once served did not disappear when the theological belief faded. The need for meaning, for community, for a sense of ultimate purpose, these are not optional features of human psychology. They are core to what it means to be human. This is not an easy task. In fact, Nietzsche believed it might be the most difficult thing a human being could attempt. It requires what he called amor fati, the love of fate, the willingness to embrace your life with all its suffering and impermanence and to say, yes, this is what I was, this is what I am, I would choose it again. The eternal recurrence, Nietzsche's most demanding thought experiment, asks, if you had to live your life over and over again exactly as it was for eternity, could you bear it? Could you more than bear it, love it? This is not a cosmological claim, it is a psychological test. Can you affirm your existence, not despite the suffering, but through it? We are living right now in the world Nietzsche foresaw. The institutions and shared narratives that once gave Western civilization its coherence are fragmenting. Religious attendance is declining. Trust in governments, institutions, and media is at historic lows. The great secular ideologies of the 20th century have either collapsed or revealed their own catastrophic limitations. And in the absence of a shared story about what we are here for, people are increasingly finding meaning in tribalism, in consumption, in outrage, in digital fantasy, in anything that can fill the silence. Nietzsche's challenge to us is not to go back. He believed that was impossible, and that nostalgia for a pre-modern worldview was itself a kind of spiritual cowardice. Nor was it simply to accept the void with a shrug. His challenge was to become the kind of person who could confront meaninglessness honestly and respond not with despair, not with fanaticism, not with distraction, but with creative depth. The psychologist Jordan Peterson, drawing heavily on both Nietzsche and Jung, has framed this as the question each of us must answer individually. What is it that you genuinely value? Not what you're supposed to value, not what your social group tells you to perform, but what, when you encounter it, gives you a sense that this matters? What burden are you willing to shoulder? What truth are you willing to speak, even when it costs you? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that the death of God, if properly understood, demands of us. Because if there is no cosmic author writing the meaning of your life for you, then the terrifying and electrifying implication is that the responsibility falls to you. The madman in Nietzsche's parable says something remarkable at the end of his speech. The crowd does not understand him, and he looks at them and says, I have come too early. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Nietzsche published The Gay Science in 1882. Over a century has passed. The event is no longer on its way. It has arrived. And perhaps only now are we beginning to truly hear it. The question Nietzsche left us is not whether the old foundation has crumbled. It has. The question is what we will build on the ground that remains, and whether we will have the honesty, the courage, and the depth to build something worthy of the human spirit. That, ultimately, is the challenge of our age.